Today's book review is Richard II by William Shakespeare. Now, this is one of scripted book reviews where I go through my archives and kind of dig out old book reviews from university or blog posts and just kind of make a video of them. Richard II, so a little bit of background here, maybe you already know this, but maybe you don't, is that Shakespeare's histories, you can kind of block some of them together. So Richard II, Henry IV Part 1, Henry IV Part 2, and Henry V kind of more or less all form one unifying story. Starts with kind of the events that are starts with the events that are started in motion with Richard II, continues all the way to Henry V, and some people will also include in that same chain Henry VI Part 1, 6 Part 2, 6 Part 3, and Henry VII, and put them all together as kind of story of 8 plays. The names of them sound really boring. Like if you're going through a list of Shakespeare stuff and you see King Henry IV Part 1, King Henry IV Part 2. When I was a kid and I was kind of glancing at the list of Shakespeare plays, I thought, oh, who would want to read that, right? But actually, Henry IV Part 1 and Part 2 are some of the best works Shakespeare ever did. They sound boring, but they're a lot of fun. King Henry IV Part 1 and 2 are not actually about King Henry IV. It's just, I guess it was a tradition that you name every play after the king at the time. They're about kind of a young Prince Hal. Now, there's debate about how much of this is historically accurate and how much Shakespeare actually invented. But the story in these books is that, in these plays, is that Prince Hal is going to be king one day, but he's kind of young and irresponsible, and he's hanging out with an old knight named Falstaff, who is just kind of a drunken buffoon, and they're out kind of having fun. Well, the king is kind of dealing with the crisis of the various crises that are going on. So it's an interesting kind of coming-of-age story. And then there's also just a lot of humor in the tavern scenes with Prince Hal and Falstaff and stuff like that. Now, I had read King Henry IV Part 1 in a previous English class, a class on general British literature. And then I had done kind of Henry IV Part 2 as an independent book report, which will probably be the next video. And then I was in a different Shakespeare class after that where we were coming back to King Richard II, which was the first play that kind of sets this in motion. Now, the young Prince Hal and Falstaff aren't actually in Richard II, but this is where the King Henry IV kind of comes in and usurps the throne, even though it doesn't rightfully belong with him, and that will kind of create the tension that kind of comes apart in King Henry IV Part 1 and 2. So I knew this was kind of leading into it, and I was kind of pleasantly anticipating this. Okay, this is where it all gets started. And then was a little bit disappointed to find out how boring King Richard II actually was. Put some of that in these reflection papers. All that being said, just because I'm a bit of a geek this way, I couldn't help thinking, it would be cool to make a movie series out of this whole thing. You start with King Richard II, and then you go through like the whole 4 movie series, and you see how these characters evolve over time. Now, there's not a lot of characters that carry over from Richard II to King Henry IV, but there are a couple. King Henry IV being the main one. And then there's a couple others. And then, well, I'm jumping ahead of myself. If you look this up, there are a few characters from Richard II who pop up in some of these later plays. Now, I wrote this back in, 1998. I don't remember the exact year, but in the late 90s when I was at university, I wrote kind of, oh, wouldn't it be great if somebody just kind of made a film series out of this? Now, I think they did kind of. There's a project in the BBC in the 70s when they went through and they filmed every Shakespeare play ever. Not with like big production values. I think it was all just kind of up on a stage. And I'm not sure if they kind of kept the actors consistent through the Henriade tetralogy. Maybe they did. But more recently, just a few years ago, the BBC did the Hollow Crown series, in which they filmed all 4 of these plays as one big kind of event, and made like a whole television series out of it. Relatively decent production values. I mean, they couldn't afford the big battle scenes, but, you know, because it was made for television, but decent. And when this came out, I was really looking forward to it. But then, and I still haven't seen the whole thing to this day, partly because of access issues. I haven't been able to track down a copy here in Vietnam. But when I was back in the States, a friend with a Netflix account helped me out watch the first 2 of them, Richard II, King Henry IV, Part 1. And I thought it was such a cool idea, but then they didn't keep the same actors. They changed actors between Richard II and King Henry IV, Part 1. And I thought, well, why? I mean, surely the whole point of this is so you can kind of see these same actors in the same roles. Otherwise, why do it as a series? I mean, why not just do it as one-off films? I don't know. But anyways, this is a reflection paper I did back in the late 90s, imagining this tetralogy as a film series. So, it says, you know, before I read King Richard II, I had already actually read Henry IV, Part 1 and Part 2 in the previous course. So I began kind of King Richard II with those plays in the back of my mind. I thought it'd be interesting to see how many of the same characters in those plays would be presented here. This one would be for the first time to Shakespeare's audience. I think it's for the first time. I mean, it's definitely for the first time chronologically. I think in terms of like when these plays were originally coming out, I think they came out in chronological order. I'd have to look that up on Wikipedia, actually. I don't know if anyone has done this before or not, but I think it would be a neat idea to make a movie series out of all 4 plays in the tetralogy. So the filmmakers could get decent actors and get things very well done. In other words, kind of imagining the full big budget Hollywood treatment. And then the actors could stay the same from movie to movie. Now, there are not many characters who would last all the way through all 4 plays, but there are a couple. For instance, looking this up in Shakespeare A to Z, Aumerle appears. Aumerle was, the Duke of Aumerle, he was kind of a big plot point near the end of King Richard II near the end of King Richard II. He was the young duke who had betrayed Henry IV, and he was going to be killed, but his mother pleaded for his life. That whole kind of plot point at the end of Richard II. He actually pops up again in Henry V. He's a Duke of York now. Maybe. Actually, I was just looking this up on Wikipedia before I filmed this. There's some debate about whether it's the same person or whether it's intended to be the same person in Shakespeare's plays. But it looks like it's the same person. And the historical person did actually have a number of appointments throughout the life of Henry IV and Henry V. So, you know, that would be kind of one example of a character. I think actually he's the only one who was in Richard II and Henry V. And this character doesn't even pop up in the Henry IV plays, so you kind of skip 2 of them. Unfortunately, again, the BBC series didn't do this. They recasted the actor for Henry V. I would have thought it would be cool to just kind of keep the same set of actors through this tetralogy. I don't know why they recasted it. I don't know. I think it would be cool to film the whole thing and keep the actors consistent. But the big problem with doing this, especially if you're doing this as a big budget Hollywood release, is that King Richard II, the play Richard II, is so boring. Now, like Henry IV Part 1 and Part 2 and Henry V, those could have mass appeal, conceivably, as far as a Shakespeare play goes. And by the way, I wrote this back in the 90s when there was a trend of having a number of Shakespeare plays in theaters. Midsummer Night's Dream, Much Ado About Nothing, Romeo and Juliet. I think that's gone on a little bit out of fashion nowadays, but you know, wait long enough and these things will come back into fashion, and it'll be fashionable to make movies out of Shakespeare plays again. But yeah, Richard II was just so boring. So you have Richard II, everyone goes to see it. It's so boring and confusing. There's no comic relief. There's no kind of big, tense action sequences. And then how do you get them to come back for the rest of the plays? Then the whole project is sunk. That being said, there are at least a couple of scenes which I think lend themselves to filming. First of these is Richard's death scene. Now that one's exciting. This one almost seems like it's written for a Hollywood movie. You have got this sword duel. Richard kills two of the men in a sword duel, and he almost escapes. And then just when you think he's safe, Exton stabs him in the back. Plus, during the sword duel, Richard kind of kills one of the men, and he just has this perfect one-liner. He says, "Go thou and fill another room in hell," just as he's stabbing the guy. You know, it's a kind of classic action scene one-liner that, you know, Sylvester Stallone or Bruce Willis could say as they dispatch a guy. Interestingly enough, again, going back to the BBC version, the Hollow Crown recent movie version of this, they completely cut that out. I think in their version, Richard II, I don't remember, he commits suicide or something, but they get rid of that whole big duel at the end. And the line, "Go thou and fill another room in hell," I think he's directing at himself as he kills himself. I don't remember, I have to rewatch the movie, but they changed it. The second scene, which I think would lend itself well to filming, is a duel between Bolingbroke and Mowbray at the beginning. Yes, and to give credit where credit is due, this is a scene that the Hollow Crown production did kind of milk a lot of tension out of. They did good with that one. My only worry would be that the audience, after what would be a confusing first scene, if it were presented without the footnotes, right? Because when you read the play, you have the footnotes explaining who the characters are, but when you're seeing the movie, there's no footnotes. They would have no idea what the duel is about. You know what? I saw the movie version. I thought they did all right on that. I knew what the duel is about. At any rate, though, the film could have dramatic music, and it could cut back and forth between Bolingbroke and Mowbray, each looking like they couldn't wait to cut the other to pieces as all the preliminary stuff was being said. Throughout this whole scene, you could have shots of Richard that are also interspersed, and the audience can see him sweating and looking nervous and fidgeting until he can't stand it any longer and he yells out to stop the duel. Yeah, they actually did a good job of that in the Hollow Crown one. The third scene, which I think could be filmed very well, would be the scene in which the Duke of York is pleading against Aumerle, and the Duchess and Aumerle are pleading for Aumerle's life. Again, it could be very dramatic with everyone pleading and being very emotional and shouting. The camera would have lots of quick shots, and it would not be clear until the end whether Aumerle would be pardoned or not. Again, to give credit where credit is due, they did that scene very well in the Hollow Crown BBC production. I don't remember if they did a lot of quick cuts. I think it was just kind of a long take. I don't remember. But that scene was very dramatic. And when I watched that movie, I had more or less kind of forgotten about this reflection paper I had written 20 years earlier. So I didn't remember whether Aumerle's life would be saved or not. So it was tense. You're like, is he going to spare his life or not? Which I really felt when I was watching that BBC production. Okay, the second reflection paper on the same play talks about kind of the women in King Richard II, and King Richard II, the play. So the character of the Queen is an interesting one in Richard II. The Queen is portrayed as someone who, in spite of what might be thought of as a powerful position, actually has no power. Now, the scene in the garden is interesting because that shows how little the Queen actually knows. The Queen is a character who, one would think, would have a pretty good idea of what was happening. However, the Queen is left to obtain information from the gardener. There is a lot of irony that the gardeners know more about politics than the queen. Another scene which portrays the powerlessness of the queen is the emotional scene in which she is parted from Richard. The queen's pleading goes unheeded, and though Shakespeare shows the emotion well, the queen ultimately makes no impact on any of the rest of the characters. Another woman who is portrayed in a powerless manner is the Duchess of Gloucester. Although her husband was killed, she is powerless to avenge him and must plead with John of Gaunt to do so instead. When John of Gaunt refuses to, then she is left with no recourse. The character of the Duchess of York is in some ways different. She is able to make a difference, although if King Henry had decided not to listen to her, she would have been powerless as well. She is powerless to stop her husband, the Duke of York, from going to accuse Aumerle. She is also powerless over what Aumerle does, although it is on her advice that Aumerle pleads for his life before his father can get to Henry, thus ultimately saving his own life.